Suchitra, Jan, and you.
Great. So let me go ahead and start the recording. So TST meeting August 29th. Last week's recording got corrupted, and Bill's taking a look at it, and I don't know if it's going to be salvageable or not. I don't know what went wrong with it. I've been derelict in getting some of the recordings put up, and I'm working on that. So hopefully the YouTube channel will be relatively complete here pretty soon.
There's definitely something going on with YouTube because I'm having a really hard time posting my videos to keep getting stuck on processing.
Yeah, that actually happened to me too. Okay, so the big topic today is, well, first of all, if we need to be making any decisions, I don't know that we do, but let's talk about the shared delusion release. And then we'll go to the bigger topic of longer term release planning or release model, which we started that discussion last time. So I think there was sprint planning yesterday. Everyone, we know what the critical bugs are. We have a plan, which is in pretty good shape, except now master's not building, and there's no update on that, is there?
So I've been in contact with the Canonical people. So there's an update to another package that Mass depends on, or they're basically not shipping. They changed the file name of something, and that is preventing Mass from bringing up compute nodes. And that, because we can't do that, our testing pipeline is broken, and we have a few things that are waiting for testing that actually fix master. So we have sort of two layers of broken, but Canonical knows about it. They have to go build a 1.9 version because they don't actually have that running anywhere. For my conversations with the person who I think runs the Mass project there. So I guess that gets done when it gets done. I don't know what their timeline is on that.
All right, so any other feedback, comments on that particular problem? Okay, so I think the real question, not the real question, the other question that is, what do we do while we're spinning our wheels? And so we were operating under a hold off any commits until we could check into the support branch. Do we want to alter that to get some fixes into master and maybe documentation, or just stay with the current plan? Any comments?
So I would at least like to have it freed up so we can do documentation updates, since those aren't going to affect correctness of any code, and it's easier to work on documentation, in sections, so we don't step on other people.
So I'm certainly fine with that, and so the discipline here would be, if it goes into a /docs directory, it's fine. Otherwise, don't be approving each other's commits until we cut a support branch. Anyone have a problem with that? Is there any more leeway we should allow for, or just stay with that for right now? Okay, not hearing any other pressing changes. Let's go ahead and allow for check-ins to doc. We'll just keep reevaluating by email and Scrum and so on daily until this is resolved. Short of not counting this particular snafu, which we always have one of these at least, I thought we had a pretty reasonable plan for this bug fixing, hardening, documenting sprint. So I think we're good there. Any other comments or follow on to that? Nothing really is, well, except the obvious has changed since yesterday. All right, so let's move on to the bigger question of anything we wanted, any changes we want to make more broadly to the our release model. And there's been a great exchange of email. Let me try to summarize some of the high-level bullets, and I think they are things that will have broad agreement, but let's just see. So first one is that there seemed to be a strong sentiment that components should evolve independently. They should be, have their own release cycle. It may be feature-based. It may be time-based for that matter. It would be a component-by-component decision. And components are, of course, published with documented and well-defined APIs. That's good practice. A second point, and this, I think you just saw the email from David, so I think that's consistent with what he was asking for. The second point is that we probably would benefit from a finer grain distinction between maturity of different features that get released. Right now, we have a very coarse grain official experimental. We could include various grades of alpha and beta in that. Probably don't want to go crazy, but that seems like a reasonable thing. I think the third big bullet is that we want to think about the releases we do as distributions. Historically, every release, while one could argue it was a distribution, they were always one-to-one with a new version of the platform, and they always came with at just one flavor, which was our Cord. As we start to have more flavors and we get a more, maybe, hopefully the platform stays relatively fixed, and yet we could continue to produce distributions. These things that have been conflated are now decoupled. I don't think it's controversial that we think of our periodic releases as a distribution of these independent packages pulled together in this thing called Cord. So if there's general agreement to those three principles, again, incremental and continuous delivery of independent components, maybe adding some more granularity to how we stamp particular components as alpha, beta, production, experimental, and so on. Exactly what those are and what fits in each category is TBD. And we periodically produce distributions. And I think a subcomponent of that is, and there can be intermediate releases if that's appropriate. So we can still, it's not prohibiting us from doing more frequent service patches that include the latest Cord or whatever it is. Those three principles, have I summarized, have I captured the key principles of what we'd like to see happen?
I believe so. The question is, do we want to start doing that with this release from the next release?
Well, so if you squinted, we've already been doing it. It's just that we didn't have enough examples of all these independent things. Depends on how you want to look at it. But yeah, what's the open questions, and maybe it would be helpful if I said what I think is still an open question. The open question is, when do we start, and what is the cadence of this distribution and any intermediate releases? And so by default, if we don't take any action, even if we believed all these other things were good, we would still be on a four-month distribution cadence, and hopefully we continue to make progress on all these other three principles, making them in fact be the case.
So something that I'm a little bit fuzzy about still is, do we have the mechanisms in place to actually implement these principles in terms of, decoupling all of these modules into independent things and releasing them separately? So it seems like we need some way of tagging individual things with a version number and some way of managing dependencies between these things. And I don't know that we really have that.
Okay, great point. And I agree that we do have to have the mechanisms to support. So we could separate possibly the discussion of what do we want to do from how do we do it. And maybe we're not quite ready. So arguing that we're not quite ready to do it is valid. Tagging, dependencies. What else? Just from a thinking, suppose we had individual pieces tagged appropriately, and supposing we had the dependencies, we still need to build the distribution and pull some things together. So that's the, we've got tools for that, but they're maybe not general enough to support the level of picking and choosing that we would want to support.
Right. So yeah, so I agree with the principles that you've outlined, and I think that that's the direction that we want to go. But it seems like we need to put some thinking into how we're actually going to get there. And I don't think it's the case that we could just decide today, okay, we're going to do this right now, and then it just happens. There's, I think, a lot of details to be worked out about how we actually do it.
So one other thing that might be that we might want to think about is what if we have these different categories like alpha and beta and for release, maybe we should think about what we should require of those. For example, maybe release means we have certain levels of testing. We have end-to-end tests on that they can be deployed and run by QA. Or maybe alpha means it builds. I think nailing down what those sorts of things are and what we require of them from both a functionality and a testing standpoint, and maybe even a documentation standpoint would be a good idea.
All right, documentation, testing, I think the other element is support. If you're going to declare this particular module general availability, then that means you're going to support it.
Right.
Of course, and so then the question is who is going to support it?
Right.
So that gets us into a level of ownership that has been implicit, but would have to be made more explicit. So the challenge here is the bar is quite high. We're not there yet, but there is possibly some value in setting the bar so we know where we're headed. So let me bring in the other factor, which is the cadence. If we had the machinery in place and the definitions and the discipline and everything, my own perspective is that a longer cadence on the order of 6 months would be warranted. Can we? I wouldn't want to go longer than that, just given how green the project is. I think that periodic syncing is a good thing. If we were to go with that and make that decision, say 6 months, does 6 months give us enough time? And maybe the other way to look at it, is it a priority that we would actually put in place the mechanisms that we've just been talking about? I don't know that we can get that done in short order. Is 6 months enough? Or should we postpone this decision? What I'm worried is if we postpone this decision, other priorities are going to jump up in front of this one, and we're just always going to be chasing it. Because we've been talking about semantic versioning for most of a year now, and we have to make it a priority if we're going to do it.
I'm not sure how I got how the priority matter with the release time. But I don't think that moving from 4 months to 6 months will actually make any difference unless we template the machinery and the thinking we need to move to a component-based release. I think that will make the real difference, not moving from 4 months to 6 months. We'll just have issues one less time a year.
Yeah, so I think you're right. Until we have the machinery in place, the 4 and 6 is arguably a moot point. The but is, does making this next release 6 months give us enough time to do everything we want to do and get that machinery in place? And or does doing that put our feet to the fire in a way that would help get that done?
So the crux, this is Govinath, the crux there is, what do we mean by everything we want to get done? I personally believe that we might be chewing off more than we should for the 4-month release. For a 6-month, so I think ideally what should happen is for the 6-month release, we should plan what we usually do for the 4-month release, and then have the rest of the 2 months be a place where it kind of simmers as alpha and beta for a couple of months before it is released generally. So the definition of what we want to get done in 6 months should really be what we usually do in 4 months. I think that will definitely give us a lot more control over how many features we release and what we release.
I think the issue though is that we haven't really been scoping it that accurately, right? So if we were to look at our feature list, we're hitting at about maybe 50% of the features that we had planned for this release. And so I guess the question I would have is if we were to look at 6 months, right, would we say that feature freeze is really 4 months in and then the last 2 months is really working on bug fixes?
Working on bug fixes, critical features and bug fixes, you know, as we have found, it's never possible to say I'm going to absolutely stop working on features. Just drawing that line in the sand has very rarely worked. So I would say only work on critical bugs and features in the last couple of months, focus being on stability, but if there is one feature that we want to push through, I think that's okay. That's why we call it an alpha, because it's still going to be in development. So my suggestion, I actually put that in the email, is at the end of 4 months, we basically do a general feature freeze and release an alpha. At the end of the 5th month, we do a release of beta, and then we go for production at the end, the general availability at the end. But that means that at the end of 4 months, we absolutely need to stop building, or we should scope it in such a way that we stop building features at the end of 4 months.
Yeah, all right. So that sounds appealing. That we, but what you just said is that we do go to a 6 month, but we're not try to turn that into 50% more work because we're not going to get it done. That we pull back our feature freeze significantly and spend 2 months making it right. And I think our definition at that point of bug fixes can be a little bit generous of things that are, you know, cleanup, documentation, hardening, adding tests, those things that reduce our, you know, our pride in what we've released. We improve the pride, reduce the embarrassment.
I guess the question I have is, are we still trying to do agile or waterfall, right? So do we want to do agile and have a prioritized list? And within the context of the prioritized list, we have features, and with the features, right, we all work on a feature, get it done, make sure that there's unit testing, documentation, and feature testing. And so as a feature, we're delivering features incrementally, and then it's done, we move on to the next priority item. My concern is we're building in quite the back end in terms of testing, validation, documentation. We're essentially deferring that.
Yeah, I would. That's good. That's a great point. That we need to adjust our definition of done, and then so that argues we don't need 2 months at the end, or we don't even need a whole sprint because each feature gets checked and it's done. Of course, be a little
Modular maintenance.
Modular maintenance, yeah.
Yeah, I think that was the in which we were going. work on a feature complete with test and documentation, a minor version for that component with that feature. And then when we, every n month, we make a checkpoint for the distribution, the latest released features in every component.
So I do think it's a little bit risky to use the past as a prediction of the future. I think we bit off some really big features. And they were the first word of the feature was always refactor. And I may be wrong about this, but I really hope and believe that we are at the point that features become more modest in scope. And I think we have to make them more modest in scope. Maybe that's the key difference here. We're not going to refactor the build system again. We are going to add this feature to the build system.
So I think the other thing is that we need to be careful of what seems to happen at the end of every release, where there's, you know, each person seems to have a feature in play, and it's not quite done, and there's this huge rush to get that last feature done to meet the release date. I know that, you know, I had to stop working on hard-coded dependencies, so, you know, pick a spot and stop working. Sapin had to stop working on the synchronizer. You know, we've been agile throughout these features so that we, you know, check them in incrementally, so that we're not checking in something that's known to be broken, and so that what we checked in so far is complete. But the feature itself, you know, kind of ended up with this artificial line drawn through it. So, I mean, if somehow, you know, going to a 6-month release, maybe we could have one sprint of wiggle room where there's, you know, we plan for everything to be done, but, you know, you've got a sprint to just finish out your last feature and make sure it's right. Does that make any sense?
Well, you're allowing time for the human nature of trying to get everything in at the last minute, which probably does make sense.
I don't know, I really have the feeling that moving from 4 months to 6 months, keeping the same workflow we're keeping now, we are just postponing by 2 months the same issue we are having now.
I think I agree with Matteo, but I feel like if we have, if all we're doing is changing a time period when maybe we should focus on feature completion as directing when a release happens, that might be better. But then we reach the point where if we bite off a lot, it's like, okay, do we want to have a release this year?
Well, no, I don't think. All right, so I don't think Matteo was saying we go to a feature-based release model.
Right.
That you're still producing a set of features, but
right.
you have a deadline. You have whether it's 4 or 6 as to when you cut off is the.
Yeah, I think what I'm getting is that it doesn't, like, the time-based thing maybe isn't the best way to measure it. Maybe we switch to some sort of acceptance criteria-based model, but I'm not sure how that would work.
Well, I think you still have an acceptance criteria on a per feature basis, and that acceptance criteria needs to include it's documented, it's tested, it's so on and so forth. And the thing that I keep coming back to is everyone is thinking about that in some context, and yet we have a dozen contexts, and this thing that happens where we're trying to produce I think giving us the mental model that it's a distribution, says, look, all of you 13 components, get the features you want in, you know what everyone else's feature that you're depending on, so we now have the dependency graph, we have a timeline for each one of those, and then after X months, we're going to cut a distribution. I think we really, in my view, we've been locked into monolithic thinking too much. Now, the problem is we don't have a distribution team. And so I mean, maybe you could argue the build system is that distribution prep team, I don't know. But I think it would have to be much broader than that.
So will the distribution be free to, the team will be free to use XOS version, you know, N-1, use the previous version? If, I guess what I'm trying to say, XOS is under development, but use the most recent released version of XOS. We're going to break this thing we've been doing where we declare everything monolithic and every component gets released as what it is at the same date. That,
right.
I think that's
I mean,
what we need to do.
Yeah, I think that's right. And if the XOS team wants to get another feature in there and they don't get it done by the deadline, then there's no choice but to go with the previous release. Now, if you hit the, you know, you got something available, that's great, assuming it's got some amount of backward compatibility in it. But the flip side of that, well, is cascade, because if you promised a feature on a particular date that was going to hit the next release, the next distribution, and someone else was depending on it, you know, we've been dealing with that with ONOS. This is just generalizing that problem. It obviously does not eliminate that coordination between components. You're still making promises of features. People are depending on those features, and you do or don't hit a deadline.
Of course, we will have dependencies between components, and components should provide features that are requested for the release, but treating every component as a different component, I believe will make our life easier, since we will be doing way more smaller release, so the release time will be shorter because you have that just a subset of code. And I think it can help us also with flexibility of the platform, treating really everything as a separate component.
So what do you mean by component, and what granularity are you thinking?
I'm thinking XOS, ONOS, Volta, and the different profiles are called horizontal.
And the platform is also another feature, Matteo? I mean, another component?
I think that the platform is what we do as distribution release.
Exactly. I guess my point is that I've always wanted to break this notion that the platform and XOS are the same thing. I mean, we tend to treat them as the same. We update them as the same.
So Matteo, it sounded like you equate the platform with the distribution, but the platform defined broadly to be a set of core components. I mean, that's not an unreasonable way to look at it.
I don't know. I think I agree with Scott that we should separate the platform from XOS, also because our design documents say that this is on commodity components that can be replaced. So if we cannot separate them, they're not respecting our own design.
Well, why don't we, I mean, as we started out here, Andy pointed out that we don't have the mechanisms in place. And I certainly don't hear consensus that we immediately jump to a 6 month. If no one has been arguing for that very strongly, I'm the closest one to arguing that position.
No, sorry, Larry, but I understood the opposite, that we said we wanted to remain to the 4 months, right?
Well, right. So I was right. I was trying to say that changing one of the potential changes on the table is to 6 months, and there's not support. I'm not hearing any strong support for that.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that someone wasn't being silent and suddenly wanted to say, no, I thought we were going to go with 6 months.
Okay.
All right. So we're not making a change with 4 months. We, in principle, believe in independent components that get pulled together in a distribution with all best practices and tagging them as GA, beta, alpha, and semantic versioning of their interfaces and so on. We still need machinery in place to support that model. And I guess the other thing is that we need to be more conservative / realistic in the features we try to cram into a release cycle. I guess let's return back to the issue of well, feature completeness versus giving ourselves time to push our features across the finish line by giving, I guess that just says, you know, put an artificial freeze date, although freeze is in quotes, 1 sprint earlier. Doesn't matter how long the release cycle is, giving yourself more time to finish things off is always going to be something people will want. But if we have more bite-sized features and then work on them in priority order, and we get a set of features done in a period of time, that's what we get done.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. I guess if the main problem that we're trying to address is that so far we haven't been really good at seeing into the future and understanding exactly how long it's going to take us to complete these, you know, big development tasks that we've been taking on, especially in the platform, then it's hard for me to see really how moving to, say, 6 months release cadence is going to help us with that, unless we just, you know, give ourselves more cushion to screw it up and then, you know, fix it at the end. But I think if, to the extent that we can decouple things into independent components and break up the work that we are planning into independent features on those components, then, and you know, do the process that you described of prioritizing features and then you know, doing releases on a feature basis, then that sounds like a reasonable way to deal with this. I still don't think we're going to get better at seeing the future, but at least we'll have a different framework. So if we can't see the future, then, you know, hopefully things will still work out.
So on the subject of, sorry, on the subject of predictability, I think that something that Larry said a little while back is very relevant, which is that this is not a release like other releases. I don't think it's representative of, you know, releases going forward. All of the, well, the majority of the tasks that we took on, at least in the platform team, involved refactoring and the general goal of making things much better. And that's difficult to bound, right? Because where do you stop? You know, make something better. Whereas I think that the more ordinary kind of task is you add a new feature, a new capability, and you know, it's a lot easier to scope it. So maybe that's one of the stumbling blocks in these conversations, that maybe we're drawing too many lessons or too much information from this release, whereas it wasn't a representative one. And you know, future releases are maybe going to be more disciplined and easier to scope with items that are more predictable.
Yeah, so that actually is my big takeaway, is that the biggest thing we need to do is keep our features bite-sized and not so unbounded and big.
I think if we can reduce the dependencies amongst features, that would help. I think that's one of the things that really hurt us this release, is that so many things depended on one another that it really pushed some of the big features to the very end. You know, that, you know, we wanted to use the new Tosca engine to do, you know, some of the stuff, or we wanted the service tenancy model in place, before we broke hard-coded dependencies. I'm hoping that since we've ironed some of these things out this release, we will have, you know, less of those nasty dependencies in the next release.
So one of the things that will come out of us focusing on per feature based release is that we can't very strictly define what a platform release would look like or when it would happen. One of the things that came out of the email discussion was that if we go by per feature release, we might still want to have some sort of a discipline imposed on us that is given by a strict deadline. We could possibly have the same strict deadlines per feature, but that still means that the overall platform release deadline cannot be strict.
I'm not quite sure I follow the very last sentence of that. I do agree that we still need the deadline, and so let's just assume it's 4 months, and that whatever features get done by then. And again, now this is in a packaging distribution view of the world. Whatever features get done by then is what makes that release. But coming back to individual components, that they are perfectly free to march along, you know, .1, .2, .3, .4 with all the features that they're adding.
Okay, yeah, so that's a different way of what I'm saying. So if you do have a deadline for the distribution, that means that we are basically going with the state of the features at that specific time, whether that is complete or completely tested. It should not matter. It might be in some sort of a beta state, each feature or some of the features, and we should be fine with releasing the feature as is at that specific time, right?
Or not including it. I mean, I think the degree of freedom that you can add is that you could go ahead and include it, but note that it's beta or whatever.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
you also have the choice of just not including it.
Yeah.
But this goes back to what she was saying, right? Of the waterfall versus agile. I don't know. Isn't a feature just complete if that unit test and documentation and everything? Versus is a feature complete if there's just a feature and then at some point we'll make it better adding unit test and documentation. I don't understand at this point how we define a feature complete.
I think ideally how we want to define a feature as being complete is you can deliver it as a whole with quality and documentation, right? Because if you can implement a feature and provide all of that, you could theoretically incrementally release at a per feature level or at more granular time windows.
So I'm just proposing to avoid just having features there, developing the features just because we are in a rush with low quality, and then make them better with adding unit tests later and documentation later.
I think what we want to do though is, right, we're essentially maintaining iterative regular release windows. And if we can actually maintain a prioritized list and tackle features from a priority order, the assumption is by the end of that release window, so let's say 4 months, right, we're going to have a set of features. Let's say we have 5 features and we managed to get through 4 of them with unit testing, right, feature testing and documentation, and we're on the 5th feature. If we're on the 5th feature and it's not done, it's okay. I think we would still release because what we want to hit that 4-month window. What we would do with that release is it could be a beta, right?
So
and we wouldn't
out of 5 will
release that
be a
feature.
beta.
Okay, but the general best practice is that all the other 4 features out of 5
we wouldn't have 5 of them that are in progress and not done.
Right.
And that's what we're trying to prevent.
Yeah, I'm just worried that the next release, we demonstrated what we had to demonstrate, the new features will need to come in, no one will write unit test and documentation for that feature, and that will remain there forever in the repository.
Yeah, that's the pattern we have to fix. And so unit tests, documentation, and the third thing I think is unless you are putting the beta label on it or alpha, it comes with some support. And again, we're not a company in the traditional sense here, but it has to come with some level of maintenance and support. That you're willing to stand. I mean, that basically that's the quality control in some sense, that you're willing to stand by it and you believe it to not be buggy.
Right. So, but what you I don't understand what you propose to fix these wrong
This can
behavior
work around.
there forever without unit tests and so on.
So I think one of the things we can do is as part of the stories, right? I mean, we're building epics, we're building stories. Minimally, the exit criteria for the story should be unit testing, but at a feature level, we need to make sure that there's documentation, there's feature testing.
No, I understood, but the problem we said one of the features will remain, let's say one, right? Will remain possibly in beta and will go in the release. Now you are.
That's a decision. That's a decision you'd have to make at release time.
But it's a priority issue because in the next release, what we're prioritizing is that the rest of the work for that feature needs to be done. It really is a priority issue, right? Because if we prioritize that it's done in the next release.
So I understand what Luca is saying. We might just slip on the priority of the feature, but it's not uncommon. Many open source projects have releases where some features, not all, some features are still in alpha or beta, and they continue to be in alpha and beta across multiple releases, eventually ending up as a production. So one fix is to prioritize that specific feature for the next release if you really want to get it done. If it's something that's just going to add minor value and there are other features that are going to add big value, you're right. It is possible that this feature will stay in beta for a long time. It depends upon how we prioritize that. It's a feature that we prioritize in the current release, but eventually that feature either fell off the wagon because there is another feature that replaced it, or it's not so important anymore, and that feature might continue to stay in beta. And I've seen that happen with multiple projects.
No, I understand it can happen. I just been in other meetings here where they say that we should have 80%, 90% unit test coverage. That would be a dream. And moving forward this way, I don't think it would really help the process. I'd prefer, in an ideal world, to release one feature less, but everything of a good quality. But even because if we're doing those features, usually it's because people use them at the end, right? And I know that then other demo come in and likely things never get prioritized in reality that way. I understand on the other end what you're saying. So
Look, you could look at it as a degree of freedom that you've given yourself that you don't have to exercise.
Yeah. Right. So we can actually draw an arbitrary line in the sand and say if we will not release a distribution unless 80% of the features are production grade. It's an arbitrary rule that we impose on ourselves.
So I have a question from quality point of view. So does it mean that from next release onwards, do we define features that are at the alpha and beta stage? Because everybody knows that QA is very behind and we just started very late in the Cord project. So right now we do not have, because we are still developing framework for many other components and not many tests are covered. So going forward, maybe we might have to clearly define what is the feature criteria, the exit criteria for that feature to be released. That way, the focus can be properly given from QA quality side. So let's say if we want a feature to be released with a good quality, then we might have to refocus our resources to test that particular area.
Yep, I think you're right.
Yeah. I think that's exactly what we should do, and maybe this is we go back and we have hard. This is alpha, this is beta, and one of the things is test coverage, and we can release something and say, okay, this portion of the code we consider this to be a beta release because we don't have full test coverage, and production releases are when we roll those up, we have very strict criteria as to what is what and what is, and especially in the release notes, so people know what to expect.
Right, I totally agree. Yeah, maybe we should, from going forward, I feel that that's better to define so we can do tests accordingly.
All right. Finer grained features, a strict definition of done that leaves you short of done alpha beta or production done. And by making our features more chunks, less chunky, when we get to the end of the release period, it won't be quite so painful, and we will just have a decision about that last little tiny feature. That should be all. That should be the only thing left. Wishful thinking, but.
So ideally, we shouldn't find any more moving forward big documentation stories, for example, at the end of the release, right?
So
the documentation go together with the code. So
yeah. So the way that I think we could, so structurally or mechanically, features are epics. Epics have stories. 2, 3, 4 of those stories are documented, unit tested, whatever those final points are. Those are stories within the epic, and the epic is not done until everything is done. And then, I mean, we've got epics sitting there that are months old, that are at various stages of done or not done. When we get to the end of a release, one measure of whether we've been successful in this process is to go back and look at JIRA, and you should see 100% finish on the features that made it.
Yeah, that's because also we don't use epics as categories, but as epics.
Yeah, right.
So I have one question that is slightly unrelated, but since there are just 10 minutes left, last week we ended the meeting saying that we were going to decide this week if we are going to postpone the release of Shared Delusion or not. So I don't have any news on that, but I think since we said last week that we were going to decide, we should decide.
Well, I think that we came up with a reasonable plan during sprint planning yesterday that says that we're pretty much on track. I mean, there's still a lot to do in this sprint, but we do align as to the bugs that were critical. Everyone has a documentation story. No one was saying that's absolutely not going to happen, so we're screwed. We may still be, based upon unforeseen events.
But what are the points on the other end to not release, right? So what do we think about that?
So the reason to not release would be, I think, if we consider the features not complete, and also that they're critical features. I don't think we're in that stage. I think that, you know, the features that aren't complete aren't critical, and Cord works. You know, we're able to draw a line through them, and it works as is. But at the same time, it would be, I think it would be a better release if those features were complete. But we can do that with 4.1.
Well, that, I don't know. 4.1 should be bug fix, right? Not feature release.
I think this is where we need to draw the lines, right? Because 4.1 was getting use cases onto 4.0. And then I'm starting to see that getting use cases on 4.0 means adding features to support those use cases. So I think as part of the planning, we may want to discuss what's the extent of what 4.1 covers. Because any additional time you put into 4.1 means the next release of the core platform is either delayed or feature set is much smaller, right? So that's the trade-off we really need to discuss and decide on.
So I know that there's a lot of talk about features people would like to get in, and I agree with you that we should not be using 4.1 as an excuse to do 5.0 or whatever that next set of features is. I do think the flip side of that is with the priority of getting M Cord, R Cord, and A Cord, and whichever cord I forgot on board, as much of that as we possibly can, we will encounter bugs, which of course we will fix. And there probably will be an occasional feature gap, which I guess you could call a bug, that we'll have to fix. But I would agree that we don't treat it as a way to bring in the next set of features. That's just not what it's for.
So what happens if we find very unstable about the new build system? Because QA hasn't even started anything on the new build system. So
it's not even merged, by the way.
Yeah, it is not merged. But then, are we going to release it as
That's what I'm saying. That
if we are releasing, then there is not enough time for us to test for sure.
No, so there are a couple of unofficial but actual beta pieces that we're making it. One is the build system, but we're going to include both the old and the new, and consider the new beta and the old will still be there. And the other was the Tosca engine. And again, we can support both old and new. Help people migrate as we go through this process of migrating the services and the different flavors. We help them use the new versions, and that will undoubtedly shake out some bugs. But we do support the legacy version as well.
But Larry, I agree that we support users also with another version, and that's fine, right? But here we are talking about something that has never even been merged, has never been tried. We don't even know if at the first command it will fail. So this is, you're right that this is still an unknown. This is, and I haven't heard that. I guess we're backed up now on the mass bug. I would argue it's not quite as dire as you describe it, because the new build system has been used with cord in a box, and we still need to demonstrate it with the physical pod. But all the work that's gone on the cord in the box, there's reasonably that we're close.
Yeah, so can I pipe in with something? I agree that the plan we came up with in the bug planning meetings was a good one. Took on good shape, but we've been set back by this mass bug and master being broken. So maybe what I'll propose is that we consider offsetting the release by the amount of time that we lose with this mass bug, because we don't know when things are going to come back, right? Like Zach said, we get fixed when it gets fixed. So if it's 2 weeks or something, that's really going to hamper progress.
Oh, absolutely. I think this is always contingent on that kind of thing.
Is there a medium between going to 6 months and staying with 4 months? Is this something where if we inserted an extra sprint, an extra 3 weeks, that would help resolve things?
Well, I would rather not view this as adding sprints. What we are in is a hardening period. We might slip by 3 days. We might slip by 7 days. We might slip by 14 days. We'll slip by exactly how much we slip by based upon the how long this bug takes.
So I guess
and we're always in a situation that we may have to change our mind about something. I'm sorry, someone else was, I maybe spoke over someone.
No, sorry, it was me, Larry, Ruka. Well, I said, I guess the basic thing is that we can ship something deeply broken, right? Then if something minor doesn't work, well, kind of minor doesn't work, that's fine. But shipping something that is completely broken doesn't make, of course, sense, right?
No, I completely agree with that, but I don't think I'm arguing that we ship something completely broken.
Yeah, and I also do think that we need to give critical bug fixes the airtime that they need. So if we set a deadline to something, 3 weeks from now, and that's more or less a hard deadline contingent on people getting bug fixes in, there's a chance that, corners will be cut or something like that. So that's kind of what I'm worried about, that we've got a set of pretty important bug fixes that need to get in and that need to, get the amount of attention that they deserve, rather than being compressed because of a deadline. And so, so if we
there's priorities of bugs, and I think yesterday we talked through them, and it wasn't clear to me that there was anything that was going to take a huge amount of time. But I think if there's something there, we should discuss it. I think the other thing was around the build system and treating it as beta. So my assumption then is, if we are treating the build system as beta, then that means we really should give QA the time to test it. And I don't think that we should be moving the use cases to it until QA has had a chance to test it. Right, so I think there's a couple of issues here, and one way to address the build system, at least the concerns I've heard there, is let's make sure QA has a chance to test it, and then as we start planning for the next release, or 4.1, we make sure that there's some amount of testing before we migrate.
Well, I think, yes, certainly we don't want to subject our users to a buggy system. On the flip side, we spent a fair amount of time yesterday talking about how quickly they could get migrated, because they want to migrate. They've seen the new build system. They would prefer to use it. So I don't want to postpone that until I'm not sure when. I mean, this is part of the shakedown that will actually happen too.
I think as to when, we probably want QA to take a look at the functionality and do that assessment, right? And if we feel that the time window for doing at least the initial passive testing is enough to give us a feel for it, then I think that would be the time frame for us to say, okay, it makes sense for the use cases to migrate to it, because ultimately we don't want them to migrate to it and not be able to function.
Yeah, that I agree with that, but I think it's kind of a gray area there as to when they get started. Let me also point out that when you're talking about the build system, the QA of the build system is that you can do a build. And for one thing, that's, Luca can speak to it, but my understanding was that he was planning to use this sprint to migrate to do that build. So once you can do a build, you have demonstrated the build system works.
So yeah, again, for that thing, I'd suggest that, I know it might sound bad, and people will shout probably at me, but send that code in is a new thing, okay? Instead of testing it manually, I immediately, even this afternoon, put those 4 comments in the script and I run the build. This afternoon, in 2 hours, I let you know if it works or not. Worst case, you committed something bad, you'll send a patch and you'll fix your bug and you run the build again. That's it. So yeah, the test is pretty easy to do in theory, I guess. Then how it goes, we'll see the results. But I think that's the best thing to do. If you merge that code, it can't break anything, right? So, and it's anyway an alpha or beta, who cares? I mean, merge that code, please. Give me these 4 commands, and I'll try the build immediately. And so people can stay focused on other stuff and don't try stuff manually all the time, and computers do it for us, right?
Yep.
Yeah, but the build system is more than just doing one production build. If we're going to have users use it, we need to make sure that all of their developer workflows are vetted on it as well before we start telling people to use it. So it seems to me like it's a little bit more complex.
Of course, I'm talking about the physical pod, the basic build. I can talk for what I do, but.
So Scott, I think that's a good point that we haven't really given enough attention to. That's partly documentation, of course, but from a release point of view, if we can build Jenkins, that would be if Jenkins can use a new build system for the physical pod, that would be a nice bar to get over.
Yeah,
and I think And I think, in fact, that what we're going to find is that the build system gives us a lot of flexibility from which we will then create new workflows. And no workflow that we have today is probably quite exactly right. So we're at the end of the hour. We should probably wrap up. We have, I think, we have lots of anxiety about getting this release out. There's still some things that have to happen. We're not going to ship it until it's done, but I don't think it makes sense to, at this point, say, let's give ourselves one more sprint, or let's give ourselves 2 sprints, or give ourselves 2 more months. We know what we know where the line is on the critical bugs. We know what the issue is with the build system. And again, if it slips 1 day, 3 days, 5 days, whatever it is, when we get to that point, we'll make that call on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, guys, just to conclude, sorry, last thing, there's also the feedback provided by China Mobile. I'm not saying to address all the points they made, but at least we should include the bug fix, the important bug fix from the list I let circulate. So Zach, you have more context than what I do on that. So
Luca, I think those things, I think the critical versions of those did make it on the critical bug list.
Yeah, I filed a lot of them in Jira. Maybe not all of them. Maybe we should go over that again. I'll email you the list that I have that I entered in Jira, and we'll go over that.
If you can adjust the Jira ticket number to the document, that would be great.
Okay, I'll do that.
That'd be good.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Okay. I think this was very useful. We'll keep doing it. And as we get closer to release planning for the next release, let's keep this idealized target in mind and see if we can figure out how to make progress toward it. And also, of course, keep our features modest and work them through to completion. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.